Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be here. It's an honour, in fact. I've always admired the work coming out of Loughborough, and it's really an honour to be here and to see your campus and to see how sport is so prioritised and well invested in. It's quite amazing. And I'm just excited to be here for the week. Thank you, Emma, for hosting me. And also to the Institute of Advanced Studies, who've been very generous in bringing me here this week. And I'm really looking forward to the conversations that are going to be had. But I'm going to get straight into the talks, so we've got time for questions at the end. But yeah, transdisciplinary sports studies, the promise and politics of navigating research boundaries. So researchers around the world are encouraged to pursue more transdisciplinary approaches to understand some of the biggest issues and the more complex issues facing society, from environmental crisis to pandemic health. And sport and exercise scholars are also increasingly implored to work across the disciplines. But transdisciplinarity is hard. It's really hard. And so this afternoon I'm going to be sharing a bit of my journey over the last 10 years towards transdisciplinarity, and it's been a bit of a bumpy road at times, and I'll share some of those experiences as well. But my talk today is going to be in 4 parts. First, I'm going to start making a bit of a case for transdisciplinarity. What is this? Some definitions. What is it not? Why is it important for us, for those of us working in sport and exercise studies? Then I'm going to bring in, as Emma said, I love theory, so I'm going to bring in a theoretical framework of feminist new materialisms, which has helped me thinking about the process of transdisciplinarity. And I might not spend too much time in that. Some of you might be less interested in that. But it brings me to part 3, where I apply that in my own work on women's health and sport, their health and well-being, with a case study. And then I'm going to wrap it up with what does this all mean, and sort of open up a bit of a dialogue, hopefully, with you here, because I'm sure some of you have been thinking about or are already pursuing transdisciplinarity in your own research and your teaching, your very existence in a school like this. I'm sure you're going to have lots to share back with me. So some have argued that kinesiology, which is a more, I guess, a terminology that's used in the US, but a term to recognise sports schools or departments. So some have argued that the siloed nature of kinesiology has limited the impact of our work, sort of this growing fragmentation or siloing. And this is not only in how our schools or departments are organised, the architecture of our buildings, but also our conferences and where we publish. And then also to be thinking about how these boundaries are produced in our everyday contexts. So some have been arguing for quite some time that the siloing of our work limits the overall impact that it can have. But as Choi and Pak said, life is multidisciplinary. Disciplines are the result of the artificial fragmentation of knowledge. And similarly, sport is multidisciplinary. Kinesiology is the result of the artificial fragmentation of knowledge. We created these silos, which is actually exciting because it means that we can challenge them and we can redefine these boundaries if we wish, if we're motivated enough to do so. So to think about the multidisciplinarity of sport and sporting bodies, I'm just going to offer 4 reasonably random examples, but also connected with some of the areas of expertise that I know are in the room and in your school. Concussion, for example. I'm not an expert in this area, but we have some in the room. And I don't know how we can think about concussion in sport without thinking about sporting culture, the sport ethic. Gender, how does gender play into this? What about physiology? Society, medicine, developments in medical knowledge. How do these things intersect to impact athletes' experiences their risks, their recovery, the treatment. What about sport and the environment? Sporting ecologies. How can we think about sport and the environment without thinking about the political ecology, the political economy of sport? Thinking about sports policy, mega events, as well as the science of climate change, activisms. How about gender policies in sport? They're changing all the time, very topical, very political, politicized. How do we understand gender policies in sport without thinking about the history of women in sport? Without thinking about physiology, biology, hormones, sports policy, sports politics, sports media, different forms of knowledge. When we're talking about gender policies in sport, how these different forms of knowledge have been weaponized to advocate for particular advancements or against those, responding to our changing society, understandings of gender. How about pregnancy in sport? Now we've got an expert in the room with Emma's great latest piece in qualitative research, sport, exercise and health. But how do we think about pregnancy in sport without thinking about the history of women and women's health? I'm thinking here about Patricia Butinsky's amazing work on the eternally wounded woman. We're going to have class, we're going to have race, we're going to have ethnicity, we're going to have religion. How do these all intersect? Social media. What are the norms, the values around pregnant bodies? How are these changing? How are sporting policies? How is sport knowledge, sports science, sports medicine responding to this changing social, cultural, political context? So these are just 4 examples, and I'm sure in many of your work in this room, you can think of examples too of how different forms of knowledge could intersect, but sometimes perhaps don't. And why not? So I'm not the first to be calling for thinking about the transdisciplinarity of sport and exercise, right? We've seen this a lot. More and more social scientists of sport and physical culture are increasingly calling for collaborating with scientists, doctors, artists across a range of subjects, whether this in concussion, injury and youth sport, athlete health, safety, well-being, sex testing in the category of women's sports, sporting ecologies, like I've just mentioned before. We're seeing lots of calls for this type of research, but actually putting it into action, putting it into practice is a different thing. And one person who I've seen advocating for thinking across the disciplines for quite some time and actually trying to do it is Leslie Hayward, she's advanced quite transdisciplinary research in relation to gender and body image and affective neuroscience in moving bodies. And she's had a number of interesting collaborations with evolutionary biologists, biomedical anthropologists, and really interesting kinds of collaborations there. And in some of her work, she's argued that sports scholars, particularly sports sociologists, we hold on to assumptions about scientists as deeply entrenched in the positivist paradigm, who are unreflexive of their assumptions and are unwilling to consider other ways of knowing. But she says, in fact, when you start working with some of them, this is not the case, and many have shifted in a different direction in terms of their truth claims. And Newton's made similar claims, warning that too often sociologists are insufficiently critical in their citation of psychophysiological work, because actually they lack training in these areas. But if we are to truly cross the great divide between social and nature, then we need a more sophisticated understanding of psychology and biology. And without that, we can neither deconstruct it nor reconstruct it. So for Hayward, she argues that more integrative scientific models that explore the interaction between nature and nurture offer profound transdisciplinary possibilities for the analysis of physical movement. And scholars from other subfields of kinesiology are also calling for greater transdisciplinarity. As we can see here in the examples of sports science, children disability and sport, physical activity, behaviour, and sport for development and peace. So we see a lot of calls for this type of work. But often, not always, but often this kind of work starts with quite romantic ideas that then dissolve in the process of trying to do this work. Or they can often become something of a smushing together of disciplines, picking and choosing concepts or ideas without deep understanding of disciplinary context. So often transdisciplinarity in sports studies is used as a bit of a buzzword. So we're going to go backwards here and to think about just get into some definitions. We're all on the same page. So interdisciplinary research is when a scholar or a group of researchers steps outside of their disciplinary boundaries to approach an issue from a range of disciplinary perspectives, ultimately integrating aspects from the various approaches to provide a systematic outcome. Whereas transdisciplinarity calls for a research attitude in which members of a research team arrive with different disciplinary backgrounds and often different agendas, yet they're sufficiently informed about one another's perspectives and motivations to be able to come together to work as a collective. And even when we come together, it's often in the doing that things can start breaking down a little bit. So just as there are lots of different definitions out there, there are lots of different diagrams. And often these diagrams show the differences between interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, often include lots of figures of circles overlapping in different ways. These are just 4 examples. There are also some more artistic renditions of these differences between multi, inter, and transdisciplinary research, such as these ones. I quite like the wristband one there. It's pretty interesting. So importantly, transdisciplinarity is not a call for the dissolving of disciplinary boundaries or borders, but rather an attempt to create new spaces for respectful and productive conversations and collaborations with scholars across different disciplines. So members of transdisciplinary teams are encouraged to speak from their disciplinary fields and share their expertise and insights with the group, as well as to listen to, learn from, and engage in discussions and perhaps debate with scholars from other disciplines. And they do so with the intent to produce more complex, nuanced, and multidimensional understandings of the subject under consideration. So transdisciplinarity basically refers to a dialogue with scholars from the social and physical sciences in the interest of better understanding or addressing substantive issues that are of shared concern. This could be cancer prevention and treatment, childhood obesity, disordered eating, climate change, COVID-19 and future pandemic health. And there have been these types of projects happening around the world. Here are a few books that show some of the ways transdisciplinary research is being taken up. And here's another model which shows that it's not just about research, it's also about education and the professional field. And importantly, here we need to think about, in some contexts anyway, Indigenous knowledge and how that intersects. And there are various institutes and centres around the world that are very much focused on prioritising the explorations of transdisciplinary forms of knowledge and its application. These are just 2. And one that I'm involved in here, or there, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is Te Pūnaha Matatine, which is had a big government funding. It's called a core institute, and complexity is at our heart. we build community across disciplines to solve complex problems. So it's very much people from all different disciplines with focus on building a just and equitable society, our changing climate, and human and environmental health and well-being. And I recently joined as a PI earlier this year, and it's been really interesting to see how they create a culture in which different forms of knowledge are equally valued and a truly respectful environment. Because often from the social sciences, you can feel like you're kind of the squeaky wheel in these types of these spaces. But actually, they work really hard to create a culture in which different forms of knowledge and different positionalities are respected. So how do we move beyond transdisciplinarity as a buzzword in sports studies? I think part of this is being honest about the pains and gains of transdisciplinary collaborations. Often when we see this work published, or we see it or we hear it, we read about the products of the research and less about the process. And I'm really interested in the process. Yes, like I mentioned, there are lots of challenges in doing this work. Finding appropriate colleagues to work with, those who are willing and brave enough to step outside their disciplinary silos, but sometimes personalities play a part in this as well. Constraints posed by granting agencies. Although granting agencies often call for that blue sky thinking, often when you submit your transdisciplinary research proposals with a multidisciplinary team, they often get sent to reviewers who are still looking at it through a disciplinary lens. Ethics committees, journals, many of these, although they call for transdisciplinarity, in practice sometimes are actually reinforcing disciplinary boundaries. Often reviewers will look to their areas of expertise and either ignore the other stuff or not find themselves able to comment. It's hard to find reviewers who can speak to something across the disciplines. There can be power differences between researchers of various positions, ages, stages, positionalities, career stages, and between disciplines as well. And there can be quite deeply entrenched variation in social practices, norms, and expectations within and across different disciplines. What is knowledge? What is theory? What is research? What's its purpose? Different disciplines can have very different ideas. And there are many political and epistemological difficulties of transcending disciplinary boundaries. So like I said, most of the research that we do read will be the product of transdisciplinarity, but some are writing about the process, the doing of transdisciplinarity. And these are a couple of examples that I've really enjoyed that talk about that liminality, that betweenness, the becoming process of becoming transdisciplinary, working into that transdisciplinary space, and some of the challenges in doing so. And some of us in sports studies have been thinking about this and drawing upon new materialisms, which I'll move to shortly. Pirikko Markula, a recent piece that she's had in Culture Studies and Critical Methodologies, reflects on her own work, trying to work with sports scientists at the University of Alberta, trying to understand moving bodies. And this is the piece that I'm going to draw upon today, somewhat. So now I'm going to move into part two to get into the theoretical inspiration that I've taken. And I think it's important to acknowledge that feminist scholars for a long time have been very critical about disciplines and about situated knowledges and how knowledge is produced. This is a great book that was published just a couple of years ago. And I think I'm just going to read a little bit from the introduction here because I think it's really powerful. So in the introduction, Hughes says, there is a long history in feminist thought that has been concerned with the shortcomings of disciplinary knowledge. Disciplines cut and chunk human, more than human, and other than human experiences into separate and hierarchicalized knowledge fields. Such disciplining diminishes our understanding of knowledge as intra-relational, situated, and contingent. Disciplinarity might create an external facade that the organisation of knowledge is coherent and even absolute, but it precludes potentially more insightful, creative, and interactive ways of coming to know, and indeed working towards resolving the many global problems that beset us. And yet many feminists who try to practice our research with transdisciplinarity and in consequence venture beyond our own disciplinary fields continue to experience how status, power and hierarchy work in terms of who is recognised as a knower and the status of the knowledge we produce. She continues to say that transdisciplinarity requires not just a rethinking of how knowledge is produced, which is something that feminism is well versed in. Feminist transdisciplinarity also requires a fundamental shift in the political, ethical questions that are being asked at the heart of knowledge practices. Such new knowledge practices enable us to refuse the powerful call of transdisciplinary knowledge. They also provoke us to remain alert so that we can resist the normative drag of disciplinary knowledges which repeatedly work to haul us back to the status quo. This is not an always altogether comfortable space, but it is an exceedingly generative one. And these comments here, I'm reading them, I know they're long, but they really speak to the examples I'm going to be giving you shortly. So how may we shape more affirmative transdisciplinary sports research practice or praxis? And actually, that's a genuine question. I don't really have the answers. I'm going to give you some examples of my own experience, but they're not necessarily answers to that question. I think that's a question that context matters. So new materialisms have been helpful also in rethinking research boundaries. I don't want to spend too long, and we could be here for many days if I was trying to define new materialisms, but it's basically an umbrella term for different theories with some common threads. New materialisms, broadly speaking, rejects notions of discrete boundaries between the social and natural worlds. It assumes that the material world is contingent, relational, and uneven. Reimagines the concept of agency beyond the human domain. And is focused on conducting socially, politically, and materially oriented research with the aim to improve the social world. Don't we all aim for that? And also has a dissolving of the binary between ontology and epistemology. And as you can see here, there are lots of different theoretical scholars who have contributed to new materialisms, and it's being taken up and applied in a wide range of ways across many different fields. Here are just a variety of these fields. Women's experience of depression, Simone Fullager and colleagues there. This is an amazing edited collection by Karen Murris. And education, sexuality education, and there's a whole range of ways in which new materialism is being taken up and applied. This is some of the work that I've been doing with colleagues in sports sociology with new materialisms, and I continue to be humbled and to learn a lot working with new materialisms. It challenges me to think differently about everything I know. So in my work, I've been particularly drawn to and inspired by the work of feminist new materialisms and their efforts to challenge dualisms of nature and culture and to think differently about biology, culture, sex, and gender. Feminist new materialist scholars are increasingly engaging critically and constructively with the sciences. Here are just a few examples of this work. And they've been advancing, I think, really fascinating ways of thinking about the body. For example, the performativity of hormones or the body as biocultural entanglements. One of the scholars that I've been inspired by, and many others have been as well, is Karen Barad, who is a feminist physicist and a very important thinker in relation to feminist new materialisms. Their theory, agential realism, is an epistemological and ontological ethical framework that provides an understanding of the role of human and non-human, material and discursive, and natural and cultural factors in scientific and other social material practices. These are some of their concepts. I'm not going to get into all of these today. But Barad does a lot in their work. And of particular interest today is how they encourage us to think about the processes and politics of transdisciplinary research. So for Barad, transdisciplinarity is not the integration of knowledge from different disciplines, and thus cannot simply involve drawing from an array of disciplines. Rather, from a Baradian perspective, transdisciplinarity entails thinking insights from scientific and social theories through each other. It's a diffractive reading. A Baradian approach to transdisciplinarity encourages us to interrogate the very boundaries and their production that are seemingly sedimented between disciplines, so that we might place the understandings that are generated from different interdisciplinary practices in conversation with one another. Barad's approach to transdisciplinarity is distinct in that it encourages deep inquiry and rigorous attention to the fine details and everyday practices and the effects of disciplinary boundary-making practices within research projects. And so today I'm going to draw upon the concept of apparatus and interaction in relation to our project. So apparatuses are not passive observing instruments, but on the contrary, they are productive of and part of phenomena. Barad offers such intriguing ideas and prompts us to rethink the research apparatus. They say, is the outside boundary of the apparatus coincident with the visual terminus of the instrumentation? What if an infrared interface, i.e. a wireless connection, exists between the measuring instrument and a computer that collects the data? Does the apparatus include the computer? Is the printer attached to the computer part of the apparatus? How about the person who reads the marks on the paper, or the scientists and technicians who design, build, and run the experiment? How about the community of scientists who judge the significance of the experiment and indicate their support or lack of support for future funding? What precisely constitutes the limits of the apparatus that gives meaning to certain concepts at the exclusion of others? And in the discussion of the boundaries of the research apparatus, Barad gives us the example of the Stern-Gerlach experiment. Anyone heard of this one? All right. So this was one of the pivotal experiments that brought quantum physics into being. And Barad offers this as a very tangible example of gender and science in the making. Supposedly, I'm not a physicist here, but a beam of light was shone through two magnets, so a beam of silver atoms through an inhomogeneous magnetic field, and they observed their deflection. So this was Otto Stern working with Walter Gerlach in 1922. Otto Stern was in the laboratory smoking a cigar during one of these experiments. And he'd come from a very working class or poor background, and this cigar was a very poor make of cigar. So it had a lot of sulfur in the smoke. and it influenced what happened here. So this is a page from Berard's book. It was the cigar that had the effect on seeing the split atom beam on the screen. So not any old cigar will do. The high sulfur content of a cheap cigar is crucial. Class, nationalism, gender, and the politics of nationalism, among other variables, are all part of this apparatus. So as the example of Otto Stern's cheap cigar makes quite poignant here, taking for granted that the outside boundary of the apparatus ends at some obvious or visual terminus, or that the boundary circumscribes only that set of items we learn to list under equipment, makes one susceptible to illusions made of preconceptions, including the obvious and the visible. So the cigar in this experiment is a condensation or a nodal point of the workings of other apparatuses, including class, nationalism, economics, and gender, all of which are part of the Stern-Gerlach apparatus. So for Berard, it is not simply about identifying where the boundaries are, but rather understanding how they are produced and what exclusions and inclusions, as well as the implications of these practices. So a Berardian approach encourages us to attend to the enactment of a cut. They talk about agential cuts. So where are the cuts that we make as humans, as scientists or scholars, that define where an apparatus, a research apparatus, starts and where it ends? The enactment of such cuts depends on the specific embodiment of particular human concepts. So in a Berardian understanding of transdisciplinarity, the concept of agential cuts is important as it calls for attending to the ways disciplinary boundaries are reenacted and practiced within our research projects. And a Berardian account also encourages us to explore the material differences that such disciplinary agential cuts make. What do we see? What do we not see? What do we value? Whose voices or what forms of knowledge are prioritised, which are made invisible? So that is how they enact particular realities to the exclusions of other ways of knowing. And you can clearly see there's a politic to this. So in the next part of this talk, I'm going to be speaking to how Berard's thinking about transdisciplinarity and the research apparatus influenced and inspired my research on sportswomen's health. I mean, we've got experts in the room who have clearly shown how women have been ignored from so much sports science and sports medicine research for decades. Now it's the hot topic, but you can see how gender has been that smoke that was in the room, but people weren't paying attention to for a long time. But what are we measuring here? What's the apparatus? Where does it start? Where does it stop? Do we go right back to childhood and the way society and schools and parents have framed and imagined what girls' and women's bodies can do? Is this what he's measuring? Maybe, maybe not. Surely it's the smoke in the room. So in the third part now, I'm going to offer some reflections on my efforts to do transdisciplinary research and how feminist new materialism has shaped that process. So sportswomen's health and well-being, like I said, is a very topical issue right now. From toxic sporting cultures, abuse in girls and women's sport, to mental health, to all sorts of injuries from ACL, concussion, to social media and the harms, the amounts of abuse that sportswomen are enduring, to body image and disordered eating. So many different topics. And I'm not going to cover all of this. I'm just going to give one example today that comes from my own lived experience. This is embarrassing today, about 20 years ago, I was during and after the PhD, I got really into running. It was not my history as an athlete. I've been a competitive snowboarder in my past and done lots of other sports, but it just kind of worked around PhD life and academic life. It was easy to push away from the computer and go for a run. And I got really into this, and I was carefully monitoring my diet. And I found myself in a state which I knew from my undergraduate studies, which was called at that time the female athlete triad. But I wasn't an athlete at this point. I was a PhD, early career researcher, but I was experiencing the female athlete triad. And so I went to the literature, as we do, try to understand what was going on with my own body, because my sociology wasn't really helping me here. My social theories felt quite limited in really understanding what was going on. And I was fascinated to start reading some of the physiology and the endocrinology. There'd even been scientific studies putting monkeys on running machines, the profile of mood states and what happens with an amenorrheic loss of menstruation, chronic loss of menstruation with the woman's moods, the follicular phase, the luteal phase. This is all from the 80s and 90s. And I was stumbling around in this literature. This is not my training. And I knew I had gaps in really making sense of it. There were studies like this that showed that different sports have different levels of prevalence in terms of women experiencing the female athlete triad. I was surprised they never asked why. Not so much. Why is it more prevalent in ballet and running than in other sports at this time? To me, that seemed like a sociological question to ask, but it wasn't really asked. As academic knowledge does, it's constantly moving, constantly changing. They went from this kind of one-dimensional model of amenorrhea, bone loss, osteoporosis, and disordered eating to recognising these things were on a continuum. Knowledge has continued to progress in this space. We moved from the triad to the terminology called RED-S, relative energy deficiency in sport, which recognised it was more complex and it affects other things, not just your bones and your menstrual cycle, also your cardiovascular health, your gastrointestinal, immunological, endocrine, metabolic. Okay, there are still some people working in this space who argue against RED-S. You know, the politics of knowledge is still happening. And we've just seen a new version of RED-S being proposed as well, which further advances, recognises the complexities of this condition. But what still astounds me in all these very complex models is that there's not many people really asking, why is this happening? It's lots of work looking at how it affects the body, how it affects the health, how it affects women's performances. But why? Why are sportswomen experiencing this condition? To me, those seem like places where sociology can come into this. Sporting culture, different sporting cultures, relationships, the power dynamics between coaches and athletes within a team. What kind of norms around bodies and performance are normalised within a sporting culture? What about the media? Pressures on women to look a particular way, social media pressures as well. What about the role of parents and families and siblings? So as a sociologist, I've been very interested in the impact of sporting culture and broader social pressures and expectations. And we're starting to see more of these questions being asked now in sportswomen's health and well-being, but it's taken us quite a long time to get here. So for many years, I've been fascinated, maybe a little bit obsessed, with trying to understand how sporting cultures interact or intersect with biological dimensions of women's moving bodies, health, and well-being. And I started from my own experiences with the condition back 20 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, with doing what I knew. I was a sociologist, this was my training, so I started by interviewing women, runners, in particular about their experiences of amenorrhea. We didn't have Red-S back then. That wasn't the terminology. We didn't have LEA, low energy availability, terminologies that's now being used and developed. But I was trying to understand by interviewing women, particularly runners who were athletes and women who ran recreationally, about their experience of amenorrhea. But I very quickly came to the realization that I was still limited in how far my understanding of the biological and physiological aspects would or could go. And so this led me to organising the first, it was called the Female Athlete Health Symposium in 2015 in Aotearoa, New Zealand. This was in Cambridge, and this is the middle of our Vantidrome. It was a 2-day symposium. The first was bringing researchers from different disciplines, from endocrinology, sports medicine, sociology, psychology, nutrition. The second day was focused on community. So we had parents and athletes and schools and teachers there for the second day. And so each of the panels that I set up for this were very much consciously with people from different disciplines. I was encouraging the conversation. What happens when we put an endocrinologist and a sports doctor and a psychologist and an athlete on the same panel? Where does that knowledge go? And we ended up doing 2 more of these conferences over the next few years. And it was from that first one that Dr. Bruce Hamilton, who is the lead sports medicine expert at High Performance Sport New Zealand, he was there, and he saw the potential in this transdisciplinary kind of conversation that started happening. And he set up WHISPER, which is the acronym for Healthy Women in Sport, a Performance Advantage. Originally, it was Women's Health and Sport, Performance Advantage, flip that around. But this is very much bringing people from different disciplines together to think about issues in women's health and sport. And this was set up in 2018. It's quite early days. Here he is presenting at the Sports Medicine Conference in Otago, where he's providing an overview of the team and sort of the philosophy behind this. And I must admit, those first few years of us meeting together, we kind of talked across each other like this. I'm saying one thing, but you're hearing something completely different. It took us quite a few years to actually get on the same page and to respect each other's forms of knowledge. There were some topics that we really just were worlds apart and couldn't see eye to eye, but it took time. And from this WHISPER group came a project that was around 2017 that I worked on with some colleagues from sports science and physiology, from nutrition, Dane Baker, who is a performance dietitian, and then some other amazing research team members. And this was very much a series of methodological and theoretical experiments aimed at revitalising the relationship between the sociological and biological sciences. Really underpinning this for me, I was interested to try to get to the biocultural complexities of this health condition of Red-S, or low energy availability. And so what we did is we had 3 different phases, 3 different sports. The first one was on triathlon and Ironman events, also endurance. The second was on women's rugby sevens, and the third was on weightlifting. 3 very different sporting cultures. We were bringing physiology, nutrition, sports medicine, and sociology into dialogue. There are obviously very different physiological and performance demands across these sports, different body ideals, and also different sporting structures and infrastructures and funding and support around these athletes. Obviously, in the endurance sports, Leanness was very much the performance, the physical ideal, very much normalised. Then in rugby sevens, very much about strength and speed, also a team sport. And then in strength sports, and weightlifting, obviously it's about strength, but also there were weight categories. So there was a lot of sort of quite quick weight loss techniques being used. But across these three sports, sporting cultures, we used the same methods. The survey with some demographic stuff in there, food diaries led by the nutritionists, the physiological aspect led by Dr. Stacey Sims. So we had RMR, DEXA scans, baseline bloods looking at different hormones in there. And then from the socio-psychological side, we did interviews. And often these methods were running side by side. Because anyone's done research with athletes or sportswomen, they're very busy and it's very hard to get them to commit to a project like this. So often they'd be doing one of the sports physiology methods and then they'd come over and have an interview with us. So we had to really work as a team to make this happen. And so from this project, some of us led different publications from it. And I would say this is not a form of transdisciplinarity, actually. We sort of got our data and then wrote up our piece of it. This is part of our process in terms of moving towards working together. These are a couple of papers that I led from it, and a couple of others that that came from the project. But Katie Schofield, who was our PhD on the project, her work extended this actually further. Her work was in cyclists, male and women cyclists. But we started publishing in sports science journals, which was very new to me, and I was learning a lot as I was collaborating with my sports science colleagues. And then Katie came across and started trying to work into the sociology, which was very eye-opening for her and for Stacey as well. Different reviews, different processes, different expectations. So throughout this project, I was always attending to the work that was being done by disciplinary boarders. It was kind of like the subplot of this work, where we could reach across and connect and where we couldn't. Where were these boundaries so strong that we just, even when we wanted to, we couldn't reach out and work across them. So here I'm just going to reflect on some of how Berard's concept of apparatus helped us to know the processes, practices and politics of transdisciplinarity differently. One is reading disciplines through each other. There were invisible walls within the transdisciplinary research apparatus. And such boundaries were the result of decades of agential cuts being made that have carved deep boundaries between sciences and social science ways of knowing athlete performance, health and well-being. But a Berardian approach helped us to pay attention to the fine details, the everyday practices and interactions that help make these disciplinary boundary walls more visible. So some of the strategies that we used to try to breach this divide were quite simple things, like our sports science doctoral student sitting in on the interviews, getting exposed to that method, learning about it, reflecting on it afterwards, asking questions. Regular team meetings, trying to create an open environment to ask questions of each other's disciplinary ways of knowing. The scientists would be talking about some concept or some language. I'd say, sorry, can you fill me in here because I don't know what you're talking about, right? And it was okay for me to ask those questions. Reading data sets together, sitting there, and I've got the interviews and the transcripts while we're going through the athletes' different hormonal profiles, or their blood results, or their RMR or their DEXA scans, and we're trying to read those data sets together. Simple things like traveling together for research and conferences and trying to co-present at conferences. Supporting each other in each other's sort of comfort zones. So like I mentioned before, we were sharing research spaces. We'd drive together to get to where the athletes were, and then we'd have methods running alongside one another. And this was helpful for helping us understand and respect each other's ways of doing research. There are also interactions that were very interesting in the everyday performativity of disciplinary boundaries. This is a photo here of that Whisper team that I talked about. And there are so many instances of these disciplinary boundaries being reenacted. Not in an intentionally harmful way, but they just occur. So often, you go into one of these meetings and where people chose to sit, I'd find they often initially did not want to sit next to me, the sociologist who asked the critical, difficult kinds of questions. Do I smell something wrong with me? People would just sit over there. Over time, as we got to know each other, often that changed. But when we presented a conference, and then they'd pass it over to me, and here's Holly. She's gonna do this Holly stuff, or the sociocultural stuff, or Holly the storyteller. And often I don't think this was harmful. Not intentionally harmful. It wasn't coming from a bad place. It was just confusion, not really knowing what Holly's stuff was or what sociologists do. Storytelling was often the language used to explain it. But through that Whisper group, we came to write together. We did a survey of 219 elite sportswomen in New Zealand, and I had to work quite hard to get the sociocultural in there. But actually, when we did, it was fascinating. And this was a process in which my sports science, sports doctors, endocrinological colleagues started seeing the power of athlete voice and sociocultural knowledge. Even though I just got a couple of paragraphs in the paper and had to put the quotes in a table, as a sociologist, that's a strange process. I got my stuff in there. Holly's stuff actually got in there. And there were some really powerful findings from Holly's stuff. The data showed from the survey that 73% of these athletes felt pressured by their sport to alter their physical appearance, to conform to gender norms or gender ideals, and that this was negatively impacting their health. That was powerful to go back to sports organisations. The voices were incredibly powerful. The athletes use this as an opportunity to anonymously express some of their experiences. And my last example here is how this process helped me trouble the boundaries of the apparatus. So the athletes' voices in the project were going back to the Baradian concept of nodal points. They prompted us to revisit our own preconceptions as white researchers entangled in a transdisciplinary project that was steeped in Western ways of knowing sportswomen's health and well-being. We were so focused on trying to understand gender that we missed something important. In our interviews with the women rugby players, we saw culture and ethnicity. It came out of the data in a way that we were not anticipating, where their understandings of menstruation were very much shaped by their cultural ways of knowing. So we started looking at that intersection between the high-performance sporting culture, which is very much westernised and scientised, and their cultural ways of knowing in relation to food, in relation to their spiritual understandings of menstruation, holistic views of health, which didn't match this, but they had to navigate this space, and they were. So it's through the interviews that we heard how these athletes were navigating their cultural knowledge of menstrual health. They told us that this wasn't talked about in their sporting environment. There was kind of a code used to talk about menstrual health. And their sports scientists certainly didn't understand why they wouldn't get in the cold water baths after training as part of their recovery, because in Māori culture, when you have your period, you don't get in water spaces. You don't get in the ocean, for example. Lots of different reasons for that. But the white male sports scientists did not understand it at all, and they certainly didn't feel comfortable trying to explain why. So most literature on menstruation and amenorrhea in sport is from a very clinical or medical perspective. We've missed something really important. Started to learn that there's an amazing literature, Indigenous knowledge on menstrual health. This is Ngāhua Murphy's work in Aotearoa, New Zealand, about pre-colonial understandings of menstruation and how colonisation had reframed understandings of menstruation. So in this way, the voices of the Māori athletes in this project were an unexpected interaction that rendered intelligible new understandings of the research apparatus. We came to know the research process itself as part of the apparatus that produces LEA and Red-S as a Western health phenomena, and our efforts to expand the boundaries within the project and to create space for alternative ways of knowing women's experience of menstruation in high-performance sport. So we recognised that we were part of the problem here. And so we started working with a Māori health expert, Dr. Anna Rolleston, who pushed us to go further, to ask different questions, and to approach the research process differently. This is a paper that came through in that collaboration with Anna. But through this research and providing this feedback back to the sports nutritionist, Dane, this is him presenting at a sports medicine conference in New Zealand, where he talked about then when he learned this from us, he developed a new approach to nutrition that brought in and acknowledged cultural ways of knowing. You know, with all the papers that you might get from something, it's stuff like this that makes you go, actually, it's meaningful. And this led to a new PhD scholarship for Agatha Gibbons, who we got a scholarship from Orico, which is a Silicon Valley science tech organisation, and she's doing research in New Zealand with a multidisciplinary team on Pacific sportswomen's understandings of menstruation. And she's doing amazing work there. Of course, this might all just sound like an interesting thought experiment using theory for theory's sake, but it's more than that. We know that women and gender diverse athletes around the world in elite sport, in New Zealand, elsewhere, systems have been failing them. The systems set up long ago by men for men are not working, and we need to revisit the values underpinning our high-performance sporting models so that they are more responsive to our changing world. A cultural shift is needed, and many of our sports science sociologist colleagues around the world are playing important roles in highlighting the injustices, inequities, and harms being done by sports organisations who many remain unwilling to change. And knowing how disciplines work or might work differently can be helpful in planning our interventions. And I have tried to step up and into the space as a public intellectual here, sharing our research with broader audiences, connecting with current issues. These are a couple of the papers, working with some of the colleagues that I've been mentioning, connecting these issues with contemporary topics. But this is a risky space to work into when you're calling out sports organisations to do better because they're failing their athletes. They don't like to hear that very much, and sometimes there is pushback, but it's part of the politic. And I continue to learn a lot through this process. So, lots of sports sociologists are doing this important work. But despite being experts in understanding sporting cultures, there has long been an unwillingness to bring social scientists and sociologists into these conversations and to support processes of organisational change. So over the past 10 years, I've built relationships, tried to develop mutual respect and understandings across sports medicine and sports science, but I don't always get it right. I continue to challenge and provoke my sports scientists and medicine colleagues, and many sports organisations, like I said, don't like being held publicly accountable for their inactions. I'm continuing to learn a lot about the power in disciplinary and organisational boundaries. And I'm learning with colleagues, and that's the fun thing. I don't have to struggle along doing this myself. And this is a recent paper that I co-authored with Cherie Becker and a number of other colleagues, Advancing Feminist Innovation Sport Studies, a transdisciplinary dialogue on gender, health and wellbeing. And this very much was a dialogue, so we could hear from other scholars who are working into this space from different disciplines and their experiences. Some of our key findings, coming to the conclusion here. So new materialisms has helped me. It's encouraged me to rethink some of my research practices and politics. How can I do research that really matters? What compromises am I willing to make? How might I implicitly and explicitly be reinforcing disciplinary boundaries in my research, my teaching, my work with sports organisations? How can I work across disciplines to move things along or to create change in elite sporting cultures for the health and well-being of sportswomen? So Baradian approach helped me to think about transdisciplinarity. It stands in stark contrast to some of the more usual modes of scholarly engagement that aim to bridge the humanities and social sciences. So while Barad sees the potential in innovative approaches to working across the disciplines, they acknowledge and encourage us to pay close attention to the power relations and political processes involved in this work. It's only through such approaches that transdisciplinary projects might contribute to a critical rethinking of science and the social in their relationality, and to foster more constructive engagements and reworking of disciplinary boundaries. So I think new materialisms offers us some interesting tools, but it's not the only way. That's important. For me, it's been helpful. For me, it's been helpful in understanding the power at play in redefining or policing and regulating disciplinary boundaries. But I do think with such knowledge, paying attention to the processes, the everyday, the fine practices, the fine details can then help us lead to more effective strategies for intervention. So should we move towards a more relational kinesiology? What are the boundaries that continue to limit our ability to work across the disciplines? How might sociology make meaningful contributions to transdisciplinary studies of sport? And this is a quote that I saw in the place that I'm staying at, the Elite Athlete Village, which I'm sure we could unpack many layers of this. But Loughborough University is the best integrated sports development environment in the world. So I'm sure many of you here have lots of experiences of trying to work across the disciplines. And you'll see it in your classrooms with your students, with your colleagues. What are the boundaries that are just impenetrable? Or how have you effectively worked across the disciplines? What is the smoke in the room? What is the smoke in your projects? What is the smoke in sports science, for example, or sports medicine research? Is this the social and the cultural and the political? How might some of these studies be limited by not thinking about the smoke in the room? So rather than starting from a place of defensiveness, because harm has been done by disciplines not being able to work together, right? And the hierarchicalization of knowledge. But can we try to find points of mutual interest, connection, and then build from there? For me, I think something that's helped is learning the language of those you are working with. I spent a year or more actually reading that sports science literature, that early stuff with the monkeys on the running machines and the hormonal profiles. I was starting to learn a language. So then when I reached out to my sports science colleagues, I could start from a place where they were familiar and we can move things along. And I've loved to hear my sports science colleagues talking about discourse and culture and that's through the conversations over the years, we're starting to find a a familiar language that we can work from. So doing this enables us a different starting point, new capacities for dialogue and forging new relationships, networks, and surprising allies at times. But importantly, what are the compromises that we're willing and unwilling to make when we work across the disciplinary boundaries?